A judge mocked the widow's daughter in front of the entire court, certain she was no match for him.
Miss Boone, you're a poor child. You have no place in this courtroom.
But he never expected her to win the case and stun the entire frontier. The air inside the dust-choked Blackwater courtroom was suffocating. 17-year-old Clementine Boone stood alone at the defense table, fighting to save the ranch her family had struggled to keep.
Please don't cry, Mama. We've already lost Papa, but I swear I won't let them take our home too.
Judge Thomas Crane watched her with quiet confidence, certain she would fold under the weight of the law. Then he made a public challenge.
If you win this case, I'll resign as judge.
Is he serious?
If you lose, you and your mother will pack your wagons and leave this territory by sundown. You might want to reconsider whether a little girl belongs in a court of law.
I am prepared to proceed, Your Honor.
Clementine accepted. He thought he was easily crushing a widow's daughter. He never imagined that his cruel wager would soon turn against him, leaving the powerful judge facing the very humiliation he had intended for her,
That's impossible.
and stunning the entire frontier. If you win this case, I'll resign as judge. Judge Thomas Crane's words hit Clementine in front of the entire town. The courtroom fell silent. Then, harsh whispers and chuckles spread across the room as people turned to stare at the young girl standing alone. Everyone understood what this was. It was a public humiliation. Crane leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He looked down at her with cold amusement from the high bench. If you lose, he added, you and your mother will pack your wagons and leave this territory by sundown. You might want to reconsider whether a little girl belongs in a court of law. A few cattlemen in the back rows laughed aloud. At the plaintiff's table, Elias Reed, a wealthy lawyer from out east, smirked behind his pristine collar. Clementine felt her chest tighten. She could still ask for a delay. No one in Blackwater would blame her. She was only standing here because their hired attorney, Mr. McFarlane, had been severely beaten in a dark alley the night before. The defense of her family's ranch had been thrown onto her shoulders at the very last second. But if she stepped back now, everything her family had bled for would end here. She thought of her mother, Abigail. She thought of Abigail scrubbing laundry in freezing river water just so Clementine could afford to stay in school. She thought of the honest ranch hands who had chipped in their wages to buy Clementine her grandfather's old leather-bound law books. To them, she was more than just a widow's daughter. She was proof that someone from their dusty side of the valley could stand up to the rich railroad barons. If she folded now, she would not just fail herself, she would fail all of them. Clementine lifted her head. No, Your Honor. Crane narrowed his eyes beneath his bushy brow. No what? No delay. I am prepared to proceed. That surprised the crowded room. The chuckling stopped. Crane's smile returned, tight and venomous. Very well, Miss Boone. Then let us begin. Elias Reed argued first. He paced the creaking floorboards with arrogant ease. He called the widow's claim to the Boone Ranch baseless. He stated the land had been legally sold to the Cornwall Railroad Company. He argued that Clementine had no legal grounds to dispute a signed contract. When he finished, he sat down, looking entirely satisfied. Crane turned his heavy gaze to Clementine. Your turn. She stood up. Her hands trembled slightly. She reached into her apron pocket and gripped her grandfather's old brass cavalry compass. Her grandfather was Colonel Thaddeus Boone, the legendary Union cavalry commander who had led the impossible Midnight Shenandoah rescue. He had taught her never to show fear to a bully. She squeezed the brass tight, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. Your Honor, this case is not about a simple land dispute. It is about correcting a lie. The room quieted. Outside, the faint sound of horses stamping in the dirt could be heard. My father, John Boone, died on the 10th of May, Clementine said, her voice steady and clear. Yet, the railroad claims he signed his ranch away on the 12th of May. Reed rose to his feet instantly. Objection. The girl is making up dates to earn pity. Sit down, Mr. Reed, Crane snapped. Reed blinked, clearly surprised, and lowered himself back into his wooden chair. Clementine kept going. The railroad wants this court to believe my father rose from the grave to sign a piece of paper. But a dead man cannot hold a pen. She lifted a heavy, worn book from her table. "This is the town undertaker's ledger. It records my father's burial on May the 10th. It is signed by the undertaker and witnessed by the town doctor. This ledger was never shown to my family." That changed the room. Murmurs broke out. Cowboys leaned forward in their pews. Reed stood again, his face turning red. "Objection. That ledger is not properly filed before this court. It was lost." "It was buried," Clementine said firmly, staring directly at the bench. "Because someone in this town wanted it buried." Crane's expression shifted. It happened only for a split second, but Clementine saw it clearly. Fear. He struck the gavel violently. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning, pending review of this new evidence." Gasps spread through the sweltering room. People stood up immediately. Local reporters rushed out the double doors to wire the story. Reed looked rattled, hastily gathering his papers. Judge Crane rose from the bench and disappeared into his private chambers without another word. Clementine sat down slowly on the hard wooden bench. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands were still shaking, but the compass in her pocket felt warm. An older man with a silver mustache and a faded Texas Ranger star approached her after the room began to empty. It was Hosea Brooks, her grandfather's oldest friend. He stopped beside her table. "You know what just happened?" Hosea asked, taking off his dusty Stetson. Clementine shook her head. Hosea looked toward the judge's empty bench. "You scared him." Clementine frowned, adjusting her collar. "The judge?" Hosea nodded slowly. "He didn't challenge you because he thought you were a weak little girl." Clementine stared at him. Hosea leaned heavily against the wooden railing, lowering his voice. "He challenged you because powerful men only attack people they fear." Clementine looked toward the empty bench, then down at the undertaker's ledger still resting under her hand. For the first time, she understood. Judge Thomas Crane had not tried to humiliate her because he believed she would easily lose. He had tried to humiliate her because he was terrified she might actually win. Clementine did not leave the courthouse with the rest of the townsfolk. She stayed in the small, stifling conference room beside the main hall. She stared at the undertaker's ledger spread across the scarred pine table. The adrenaline from the confrontation was slowly draining out of her body, leaving her exhausted. Hosea Brooks closed the heavy door behind him, muting the sounds of the street outside. "You understand what this means now?" he asked, pulling up a chair. Clementine looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. That Judge Crane panicked. Hosea nodded once. Judges like him do not panic over routine paperwork. They rule on forged deeds every week. Clementine stared at the ledger again. Then why did he run? Hosea rested his weathered hands on the table. "Because that ledger should not exist in your file. It was supposed to be burned." The words settled heavily in the quiet room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly seemed very loud. Clementine frowned. "What are you saying, Hosea?" "I'm saying someone hid that evidence months ago," Hosea said gently. "And if Crane reacted like a spooked horse the moment he saw it, then there is a mighty good chance he knows exactly why it was hidden." Clementine felt her stomach tighten. He was involved in stealing the ranch. Hosea said nothing. He didn't need to. Clementine leaned back slowly in her chair. The possibility had already begun forming in her mind during the hearing, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Judge Thomas Crane was not just biased against her family. He might be directly connected to her father's forged signature. Hosea folded his arms. "If that is true, Clem, this stops being a simple courtroom fight. It becomes something much bigger. You're taking on the men who run this frontier." Clementine looked at him, her grandfather's steel entering her eyes. "Then we prove it." Hosea studied her for a long moment, then smiled softly. "Good answer." He reached into his dusty saddlebag and slid a thick stack of tied papers across the table. "Original county land archives. I pulled them from the record office while the clerk was out to lunch. I figured we'd need them before someone decided to make them disappear." Clementine carefully untied the string. Inside were land grants, sheriff reports, tax notes, and old property filings from the valley. Hosea stood up, putting his hat back on. "You have until tomorrow morning before Crane regains his nerves and takes control of that courtroom. If there is a string tying him to the railroad's theft, find it tonight." He gave her a respectful nod and stepped out into the hall. Clementine spent the next 4 hours going page by page through the dusty files. The room grew dark. She lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow flame casting long shadows against the walls. At first, it looked like ordinary frontier paperwork. Property lines, cattle counts, procedural filings. Then, she found it, a foreclosure order on a neighboring ranch. Her blue eyes narrowed. It was dated just 6 days before her father died. The signature at the bottom read, Thomas Crane, Chief Attorney for Cornwall Railroads. Clementine froze. Her pulse quickened. Crane had not always been a judge. Before he wore the black robe, he had been the lead lawyer for the very railroad company now trying to steal her land. He had personally signed the orders pushing out local families. She flipped through the next pages faster. Another memo, then another, each bearing his signature, each connecting him deeply to Cornwall's land grabs. Hosea was right. Crane was not simply presiding over this hearing as a neutral judge. He was sitting in judgment over a theft he had likely helped plan. Clementine grabbed the telegraph forms from the desk and ran down the street to the telegraph office. She paid the operator to send a secure message to Hosea at the saloon. I found everything, her message read. Crane worked for Cornwall. 10 minutes later, Hosea found her outside the office. He looked at the paperwork in her hands and exhaled a long, heavy breath into the cool night air. God help him. The next morning, the Blackwater courthouse was even fuller than the day before. Word had spread through the saloons and boarding houses. People were no longer here to watch a young girl fail. They were here to see what happened next. Judge Crane entered from his chambers with his usual controlled, heavy step, but Clementine saw it immediately. He looked tired. The skin beneath his eyes was dark. He was sharper, more alert. He knew the stakes now. Elias Reed rose as the proceedings began, smoothing his expensive silk vest. Your Honor, before we continue this frontier circus, the Cornwall Railroad Company moves to strike yesterday's submission in its entirety. Furthermore, we request sanctions against the defense for introducing improper and prejudicial material. Crane looked down at Clementine. Response? She stood up. The railroad wishes to strike the ledger because they cannot explain it. Objection, Reed barked. Crane overruled him instantly. He wanted to appear fair to the gallery. Clementine continued, her voice echoing in the wooden hall. Furthermore, Your Honor, the defense requests the disclosure of all Cornwall Railroad legal personnel involved in the original Boone land acquisition. Specifically, we request to know if any sitting member of this court participated in those decisions. Uncourt. That changed Crane's face just slightly, but everyone in the room saw it. Reed immediately rose. Objection! Relevance! Clementine did not look at Reed. She looked only at Crane. It goes directly to our claim that evidence was deliberately suppressed by men with a vested interest in the railroad's success. Crane's jaw tightened beneath his gray beard. He stared at her for 3 full seconds before answering. Denied. The room stirred. Cowboys muttered to one another. Clementine spoke again. Then let the record reflect that this court has denied disclosure of the railroad's legal involvement in suppressing evidence. Crane's eyes narrowed into dark slits. Noted, Miss Boone. Hosea, seated in the front pew directly behind her, leaned forward slightly. He's rattled, he whispered. Reed resumed his argument, but his rhythm was off. His arrogant confidence from the previous day had faded. He was no longer simply defending a land claim. He was protecting a secret. The hearing continued for another grueling hour. Every time Clementine pushed toward the railroad's past conduct, Crane shut her down faster than before. Every ruling favored Elias Reed. Every objection from the railroad was sustained. Every attempt Clementine made to broaden the discovery of old deeds was firmly denied. Hosea leaned close during a brief recess while Crane reviewed a document. He's trying to bleed you out, Hosea said softly. Clementine nodded, wiping dust from her skirt. I know. Then stop playing his game. She frowned, looking back at the old ranger. Meaning? Hosea's eyes hardened, matching the iron of his badge. Stop trying to prove his misconduct in theory. Prove his involvement directly. That afternoon, Clementine left the stifling courthouse and walked straight to the county archives. She requested the employee records for the Cornwall Railroad Company from the year her father died. The nervous clerk resisted, citing company privacy. Clementine persisted, slamming a silver dollar on the counter. 2 hours later, she had what she needed: employment rosters, surveying logs, legal assignments. Every single one of them confirmed the exact same truth. Thomas Crane had been the chief legal architect for Cornwall's expansion through the valley. He was not a secondary lawyer. He had built the very contracts now forcing families off their land. Clementine stared at the yellowed paper. Her mouth went dry. This was bigger than a stolen ranch. The man trying to destroy her family was not protecting the law, he was protecting himself. Her pocket watch ticked loudly. She found Hosea outside the livery stable. "Well, he wasn't just involved," Clementine said, her voice dropping. "He wrote the contracts." Hosea went quiet, feeding an apple to his horse. "Then that means if your father's deed is proven a forgery, Crane goes down with the railroad." Clementine finished the thought. Yes. That night, Clementine sat alone at the kitchen table of her family's small ranch house. She worked by the light of a single oil lamp until nearly midnight. She organized every record, every foreclosure notice, every surveying log, every signature. Her mother, Abigail, came downstairs, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the papers covering the table. "Clementine," Abigail said softly, "we need to talk." Clementine looked up, rubbing her tired eyes. "I'm almost finished, Mama." Abigail sat down across from her. Her hands were rough from years of labor, but her eyes were kind. "Mr. McFarland sent a message from the doctor's office. He says we should drop the case." Clementine stared at her mother in disbelief. "Drop it? After everything they did to him? He says you are accusing a sitting federal judge of corruption. That brings dangerous men to our door, Clem." Abigail sighed heavily. "He says we should take the small settlement the railroad offered and move on." Clementine stood up. "A man forged Papa's name. They stole our home. And if I go after Crane directly, we might actually win. And if you miss, we lose our lives," Abigail said gently. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "This frontier rewards survival, Clementine. Learn that." Clementine stood alone in the kitchen after her mother went back to bed, furious. Hosea rode up to the house minutes later. He had heard the news from town. He stepped inside, shaking the night chill from his coat. "Your mother wants you to stop." "She's scared," Clementine said, sinking back into her chair. Hosea looked at the files spread before her. "Are you going to stop?" Clementine thought of her father. She thought of the 20 years he had spent breaking his back to turn this rocky soil into a home. She thought of Crane looking down at her from his bench like she was nothing but dirt on his boots. She looked up. "No." Hosea nodded slowly. "Good, because tomorrow, Clem, this stops being about winning a piece of land." She met his weathered eyes. "It becomes about exposing a machine," Hosea said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "And machines do not go quietly." Clementine looked down at the stack of evidence, at Crane's name appearing over and over again on the ledgers. Then she understood the truth fully. The most dangerous man in that courtroom was not Elias Reed. It was the judge. "I need a witness," Clementine said, "someone who was there when Crane forged the deeds." Hosea tapped a finger against a surveying log. "Most of the Cornwall men moved out west. Some died, but there is one name here, Levi Morgan. He was the head surveyor for Cornwall. He lives out near Ridgeview." "I'm going," Clementine said, grabbing her heavy wool coat. "Take your grandfather's rifle," Hosea warned, "and ride fast." 40 minutes later, Clementine stood on the porch of a secluded log cabin in the foothills. The wind howled through the pines. She knocked hard on the heavy door. An older man opened it. He held a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Suspicion was written across his deeply lined face. "Mr. Levi Morgan?" Clementine asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Clementine Boone. I am defending my father's ranch in court." Morgan's face changed instantly. He tried to slam the door. Clementine drove her boot against the frame, stopping it. "Please," she said quickly, "I only need 5 minutes. I have nothing to say about the Boone Ranch." "You surveyed our land," Clementine said, "and you know my father didn't sign that deed." Morgan's eyes darted toward the dark tree line. "Watch yourself, girl." "Did you know the undertaker's ledger was buried?" Clementine asked, stepping closer. "Or did Thomas Crane hide that from you too?" That stopped him, just for a moment. But that moment told her everything. Clementine held his gaze. "You didn't know." Morgan lowered the revolver slightly. His jaw tightened. "You need to leave. You don't know what kind of men you're hunting. I know they let my father die and stole his legacy. Help me understand what happened." Morgan stared at her for a long time. The wind whipped at his gray hair. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door. 5 minutes. He sat heavily in a rocking chair by the hearth and folded his arms. "I surveyed your land," he said quietly. "It was the best water access in the valley. Cornwall needed it, but your father refused to sell." Clementine sat opposite him on a wooden stool. "So they forced him?" "No," Morgan said, his voice dark. "Crane drafted a fake deed. He told me the railroad had come to a private agreement with John Boone. I believed him, or at least, I chose to." "What about the ledger?" Morgan looked at the fire. 3 days before the railroad filed the deed, the undertaker came to Crane. "He had proof your father was already dead before the ink was dry. I saw Crane take the ledger from him." Clementine's heart pounded against her ribs. "You saw him?" "He said he'd handle the paperwork personally. He locked it in his office safe. Who else knew?" Morgan hesitated. "Just one other man, the railroad's regional manager, Arthur Vance." Clementine pulled out a piece of charcoal and wrote the name on her hand. "Where is he?" "Retired, living in a brick mansion in Saint Denis." Morgan stood up. "Would you testify to this?" Morgan laughed bitterly. "Against Thomas Crane? You think I have a death wish, little girl? You let an innocent man's family lose everything." That landed. Morgan looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I've thought about John Boone every day since." Clementine stepped toward the door. "Then if you testify, Crane goes to federal prison. They can't hurt you if they are behind bars." Morgan nodded slowly, staring at the floorboards. "One statement, under oath. I'll ride into town tomorrow and swear to it." Clementine left the cabin with a profound sense of hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had a direct witness connecting Crane to the forgery. She rode her horse hard back toward Blackwater, the cold night air biting at her cheeks. She found Hosea waiting at the livery. "Morgan agreed," she said, sliding out of the saddle. "Crane personally hid the ledger. He's coming tomorrow to swear to it." Hosea's voice sharpened. "That's enough to blow this wide open. We file that affidavit, and Crane has to recuse himself. He also gave me the name of the regional manager," Clementine added. "Arthur Vance." Hosea went completely still. The crickets in the grass seemed to stop chirping. "Vance?" Hosea repeated. "Arthur Vance is one of the wealthiest men in the state. If he's tied to this," Hosea shook his head. "This is bigger than judicial corruption, Clem. This is an empire." That night, Clementine returned to the small boarding house room in town, where she and her mother were staying for the trial. The moment she opened the heavy oak door, she knew something was terribly wrong. The room had been torn apart. Mattresses were sliced open, feathers blanketing the floor. Drawers were dumped out. Her grandfather's law books were thrown against the wall, their bindings cracked. Her stomach dropped. She ran to the small writing desk where she kept her backup case materials. Gone. Every copied surveying log, every court note, every procedural filing, gone. Only one thing remained on the scarred wood of the desk. A single sheet of thick, expensive parchment. No signature, no fingerprints, just 6 words written in elegant ink. "Drop the case while you can." Clementine stared at the message. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a sudden, blinding anger. Because now there could be no doubt. This was no longer about one corrupt judge protecting his reputation. This was a machine, and it had finally shown her its teeth. She grabbed the note and ran back out into the street. She found Hosea at the saloon and said the only words that mattered now. "They're scared." Hosea arrived at the boarding house in under 5 minutes. He stepped inside, stopped, and surveyed the destruction in total silence. He looked at the sliced cushions and the empty desk. He turned slowly toward her. "Did they take anything valuable?" he asked, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Clementine held up the parchment note. Only the case materials. Hosea read it once. His face darkened like a thundercloud. They're escalating. Clementine folded her arms tightly. They broke into my room, Hosea. I know. They stole our evidence. I know. Hosea stepped closer, his voice low and steady. And that means you are right over the target. Powerful men don't break into boarding houses over weak cases. Clementine looked around her ruined room. Her anger had burned straight through her fear. Now this proves a conspiracy. No, Hosea said grimly. It proves desperation, which is useful, but it isn't admissible in a court of law. Clementine exhaled sharply, her breath pluming in the cold room. So what now? Hosea looked at her directly. Now, we stop pretending this is only a legal fight. We lock the doors, we load the rifles, and tomorrow morning, we take the war directly to the judge's bench. Dawn broke over Blackwater, painting the dusty streets in shades of blood orange and pale gold. The air was biting and cold. Clementine and Hosea stood outside the heavy courthouse doors, watching the road leading out toward Ridgeview. They were waiting for Levi Morgan. He was their silver bullet. At 7 o'clock, a horse trotted into town, but Morgan was not alone. He rode flanked by 3 men on horseback. They wore dark dusters and bowler hats, hired guns, Pinkerton men, paid by the Cornwall Railroad. Behind them rolled a polished black carriage. Morgan looked terrified. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched. When he saw Clementine on the courthouse steps, he looked down at his saddle horn. He did not stop. He rode straight past the courthouse and out the other side of town. "Morgan!" Clementine called out, stepping down onto the dirt. "Mr. Morgan, wait." The hired guns steered their horses to block her path. The black carriage rolled to a halt in front of her. The door opened, and a wealthy, impeccably dressed older man stepped out. He leaned heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane. Hosea stepped in front of Clementine, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Arthur Vance," Hosea said, his voice like grinding stones. "Hosea Brooks," Vance replied with a thin, polite smile. "I see you are still playing nursemaid to lost causes." Vance turned his cold, gray eyes to Clementine. "Miss Boone, I understand you had a late-night conversation with our former surveyor. Mr. Morgan is an old man. His memory is failing. I reminded him this morning how dangerous it can be to perjure oneself in a federal court." Clementine's hands curled into fists. "You threatened him." "I educated him," Vance corrected smoothly. He adjusted his silk tie. "The railroad built this town, Miss Boone. We own the tracks, we own the bank, and we own the law. Take your mother and leave the valley today. If you walk into that courtroom, you will lose far more than a ranch." Vance tipped his hat and climbed back into his carriage. The Pinkertons followed him away, leaving Clementine standing in the dust. Her witness was gone. The testimony was dead. Clementine felt a wave of crushing despair. She looked at Hosea. The old ranger's face was grim. "They got to him," Clementine whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "We have nothing." Hosea shook his head slowly. "Not nothing. Morgan told you Crane kept the original ledger in his office safe. Crane used to work out of the Cornwall Operations building next to the bank." "Crane hasn't worked in that building for 5 years, Clementine said. "Exactly," Hosea replied, his eyes narrowing. "When Crane became a judge, he didn't burn his old files. A corrupt man always keeps insurance. He keeps records on the men he works with, just in case they ever try to betray him. If Crane forged your father's deed on Vance's orders, the proof is still in that old railroad safe." Clementine looked at the Cornwall Operations building down the street. It was heavily guarded. "We can't just walk in." Hosea smiled faintly, a dangerous glint in his eye. "No, but I still wear a silver star, Clem, and a Texas Ranger can requisition private property for a criminal investigation. You just need to distract the guards long enough for me to crack the safe." 10 minutes later, Clementine walked right up to the front doors of the Cornwall Operations building. 2 armed guards stepped in her way. "Building's closed to the public, little lady," one guard grunted. "I am Clementine Boone," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried. I am here to accept Mr. Arthur Vance's settlement offer for my father's ranch. Go fetch him." The guards exchanged a confused look. This was exactly what the bosses wanted. One guard hurried inside to find the manager. The other stepped away from the door to light a cigarette. Around the back of the building, Hosea slipped through an alley window. Clementine stood on the boardwalk, counting the seconds. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If Hosea was caught, he would hang. If she failed, her mother would be homeless. She reached into her pocket and gripped her grandfather's compass. "Hold the line," she thought. "Hold the line." Inside the building, Hosea crept into Crane's old, abandoned office. It smelled of stale tobacco and dust. The heavy iron safe sat in the corner. Hosea knelt beside it. He had spent his youth hunting outlaws. He knew how to listen to the tumblers of a lock. He pressed his ear to the cold iron and slowly spun the dial. Click. Outside, the first guard returned. "Mr. Vance ain't here right now. You'll have to come back." "I will wait in the lobby," Clementine insisted, taking a step forward. The guard put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I said, come back later." Suddenly, the back alley door banged open. Hosea strolled out, casually dusting off his coat. He walked right past the guards and tipped his hat to Clementine. "Morning, Miss Boone. Beautiful day for a trial." Clementine backed away from the guards and followed Hosea down the street. As soon as they turned the corner, Hosea opened his coat. Tucked into his belt was a thick, black leather book. "Insurance," Hosea said. Clementine opened the book. The pages were filled with Thomas Crane's meticulous handwriting. It was a master ledger. Names, dates, bribes, payoffs, and forged deeds. And there, on page 42, was the entry for the Boone Ranch. May 12th, forged signature per A. Vance, ledger buried. Clementine stared at the ink. Her breath hitched. "We have him." Hosea loaded his revolver with a loud, metallic click. "Then let's go hang a judge." Courtroom 7B was suffocatingly hot. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, townsfolk, and railroad men. Whispers filled the room like a swarm of locusts. Judge Thomas Crane entered from his chambers. He looked incredibly pleased. He had spoken with Vance. He knew Levi Morgan had fled. He knew the young, foolish girl standing at the defense table had absolutely nothing left to fight with. The bailiff called the room to order. Crane sat down heavily in his leather chair. "Proceed," Crane said, a cruel smile touching his lips. Elias Reed stood up instantly. "Your Honor, seeing as the defense has failed to produce a single credible witness, the Cornwall Railroad moves for immediate dismissal of this case. We request the court formally recognize the Boone deed as valid." Crane looked down at Clementine. The entire town watched her. "Miss Boone," Crane said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "it appears you are out of options. For the sake of the court's time, do you concede?" Clementine stood up. She did not tremble. She did not look away. She picked up the thick, black leather book and stepped out from behind the defense table. "I concede nothing, Your Honor." Reed scoffed. "Objection! The girl is wasting time." "Overruled, Mr. Reed," Crane said lazily. "Let the child speak her final piece." Clementine walked to the center of the room. "The plaintiff claims my father signed his land away. The plaintiff claims the original undertaker's ledger was lost. But the truth is, this court is not a place of justice. It is a place of business." Crane's smile vanished. "Watch your tongue, girl." Clementine raised her voice so everyone in the gallery could hear. "Before you were a judge, Thomas Crane, you were the chief architect for the Cornwall Railroad, and you did not leave that job behind when you put on that black robe." Crane gripped his gavel. "One more word and I will hold you in contempt." Clementine slammed the black leather book onto the plaintiff's table, right in front of Elias Reed. "I submit into evidence the private financial ledger of Judge Thomas Crane." The courtroom froze. Crane's face drained of all color. He half rose from his chair. "Where did you get that?" His voice cracked. It was not anger. It was sheer, unadulterated terror. Clementine pointed directly at him. "This ledger documents over 30 forged land deeds in this valley. It documents bribes paid by Arthur Vance, and it explicitly documents the forgery of John Boone's signature, ordered by the railroad and executed by you." The room exploded. Cowboys shouted. Ranchers who had lost their land stood up in fury. Reed scrambled backward, away from the book, as if it were a rattlesnake. Crane slammed his gavel furiously. Order! Order! I demand this court be cleared. Bailiff, arrest that girl. Nobody touch her. Hosea Brooks roared, stepping through the swinging doors at the back of the room. He walked down the center aisle, his Texas Ranger star pinned proudly to his chest, his hand resting on his gun. Behind Hosea walked 3 men. One of them wore the dark suit and silver badge of a United States federal marshal. Hosea had wired the Capitol the night before. The marshal had arrived on the morning train. The marshal stepped past Clementine and looked up at the bench. Judge Crane, you are ordered to step down immediately, pending a federal review of judicial misconduct. Crane remained frozen. He looked at the gallery. He looked at the angry faces of the men and women he had cheated for years. Then, he looked at Clementine. You little fool, Crane spat, his voice trembling. You think you can tear down the railroad? They will crush you. Clementine met his eyes, cold and steady. If I win this case, you said you would resign. She took a step closer to the bench. Resign. Crane collapsed back into his chair. He had no power left. His secrets were bared to the world. The federal marshal walked up the wooden steps, pulled Crane from his seat, and locked heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. For the first time in 10 years, Thomas Crane was dragged out of his own courtroom. The room erupted into deafening cheers. Hats were thrown into the air. Elias Reed frantically packed his briefcase and practically sprinted for the back door. Clementine stood in the center of the chaos. She looked down at her hands. They were finally still. The Blackwater sun was warm on Clementine's face as she walked out of the courthouse. The dust was settling in the street. Her mother, Abigail, was waiting by their wagon. Tears streamed down Abigail's weathered face. She ran forward and pulled Clementine into a fierce, tight embrace. We're keeping it, Clementine whispered into her mother's shoulder. We're keeping the ranch, Mama, Abigail sobbed, holding her daughter close. Your papa would be so incredibly proud of you, Clem, so proud. Hosea walked out of the double doors, leaning on the wooden railing. He lit a cigar and smiled around the smoke. Federal Marshal says Arthur Vance is next. The whole Cornwall operation in this valley is being suspended. Half the town is getting their deeds back. Clementine pulled away from her mother and looked at the old ranger. Thank you, Hosea. Don't thank me, kid, Hosea chuckled, tipping his hat. I just opened a safe. You're the one who stared down the devil and didn't blink. Clementine reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her grandfather's brass cavalry compass. She traced the worn metal with her thumb. Thaddeus Boone had used this compass to navigate his men through the darkest, bloodiest nights of the war. He had always told her that true north wasn't just a direction, it was a choice. Judge Crane had looked at a grieving widow and a teenage girl and seen easy prey. He had mistaken their grief for weakness and their poverty for a lack of intelligence. He had challenged her publicly because he believed that justice belonged only to men with money and influence. He had never imagined that a 17-year-old girl would become the end of his empire. Clementine looked out over the sweeping golden plains of the valley. The land was theirs again. The earth her father had bled for was safe. She turned and climbed up onto the wooden bench of their wagon. She took the leather reins in her hands. She was not just a widow's daughter anymore. She was the defender of the valley, and if any other greedy baron ever tried to lay a hand on her home again, they would quickly learn that the Boone family did not break. With a sharp flick of the reins, Clementine guided the wagon out of Blackwater and pointed the horses toward home. And that brings the dust to settle on our story. I share these tales hoping they offer you a quiet escape from your everyday routine. I am always curious how you spend this time. Perhaps you were listening while driving home, washing the evening dishes, or knitting in your favorite chair. Tell me in the comments. I genuinely read them all. I also love hearing which country you are tuning in from to see how far these westerns travel. If you want to catch the next tale, a like and a subscribe mean everything.